Hi everyone, my name is Monique, and today I'm going to be showing you how to play a game that is currently on Kickstarter called Mythic Mischief Volume 2. Mythic Mischief is a game for 1 to 4 players in which players take on the role of a mythical faction who also happen to be students at Mythic Manor. Over the course of the game, players will be moving around a garden, shifting around hedges as well as each other while trying to avoid the groundskeeper. This game is designed by Max Anderson, Austin Harrison, as well as Zac Dixon, and published by Ivy Games, who are helping sponsor this video. Now, if you're familiar with Mythic Mischief Volume 1, then you already know how to play the game, because the rules are essentially the same. But this version comes with 4 new factions that are completely standalone, but can also be mixed with the original version. And so today, I'm going to be showing you how to play the standard 2-player version of the game, which is 1v1, and then discuss the 4 new factions as well as their various asymmetries that come with the game. If you'd like to see the game played, we've also filmed a full 2-player playthrough of the game, which is linked in the description below. And if you'd like to learn more about their Kickstarter campaign, I've left a link to the Kickstarter down below as well. Last but not least, if you enjoy content like this and would like to see more in the future, please consider subscribing. Otherwise, let's get started. So, if you'd please direct your attention to the center of the table, we're all set up here for a 2-player game of Mythic Mischief Volume 2. Welcome to the garden. If you're familiar with the original Mythic Mischief, you'll probably notice that this is an entirely new setting, although everything pretty much looks the same. Instead of a library, we are in a mythical or fantasy garden, and instead of the Tomekeeper, we have the Groundskeeper. In Mythic Mischief, the object of the game is just to be the first player to score 10 points. And so the game is played over the course of 2 halves. We have the Before Dark phase as well as the After Dark. Both halves of the game are essentially played the same, with just some stronger powers for each player coming into play during the After Dark phase. At the start of the game, in turn order, players will first start by placing out all of their pieces on unoccupied spaces on the board. Then, starting with the first player, players will be taking turns taking all of their actions based off of their board setup before moving on to the next player. And so a player's turn is actually divided into 3 phases, starting with the Mythic phase. And during the Mythic phase, the active player is essentially going to be taking the actions that are represented on their board by spending down their action die each time they take an action. Now in this game, there are 4 main types of actions that you can take, and they are represented differently depending on the asymmetric faction that you're playing as. And so one of the basic actions that is essentially the same for all players is going to be the standard move action. Each move action allows you to move one of your mythics to an adjacent orthogonal space. And so I could spend one of my actions, as an example, to just move this mythic into this space. And this is actually a very bad move, because after the active player is done taking all of their actions, they're actually going to have a groundkeeper phase, where the groundkeeper is always going to move in the direction of the next destination token. They're going to start the game by moving towards the 1, and then afterwards they'll move to the 2, and then finally the 3. And the number of spaces they can move per turn is depicted on the Before Dark card, which in this case is 4 spaces. Now, especially at the start of the game, one of your main things that you're going to want to collect are these different tomes in your own player color. At the end of your turn, tomes will be used to permanently upgrade your actions. And so, in order to pick up a tome, all you have to do is enter its space, and then you'll automatically pick it up. And of course, I would have had to spend 2 of my actions, my move actions, to get there. And if you run out of action points, by the way, you cannot take that action for the rest of this turn. And just a few other basic rules when moving: you can never end a mythic's turn on a space that contains another piece, whether it's an opponent or an ally. But you can move through the space if you wanted to. There are also a few spaces around the board that contain these clutter tokens. Entering any of these spaces requires you to spend 2 movement points. And of course, you can never enter the space that has the groundskeeper. And that's essentially how the basic move action works, and also how just taking actions in general works in the game. You always spend a point on your corresponding action die whenever you take that action. In addition to the move action, each faction also has their own asymmetric way of moving other mythics around the board, whether it's an enemy or an ally, as well as the various hedges. An example of the move mythic ability is the wander ability for the fairies. In order for them to move other players' pieces or even their own allies, they need to be positioned diagonal to the piece that they want to move. And if so, they can move that piece to an orthogonally adjacent space. Now, 2 things to remember when moving other mythics is you can never move them across hedges. In addition, you can never move another mythic piece onto the space that contains a groundskeeper or another mythic piece. Now, when moving the various hedges around the board, that is also an asymmetric ability. And so, as an example, the gnome's hedge moving ability is called Illusion. And so, in order for them to move hedges, they can only move a hedge that is adjacent to one of their own mythic pieces. And their ability essentially allows them to move the hedge to another adjacent space to that specific mythic piece. Now, when moving hedges around the board, you can never move them in a way that completely blocks off a section of the board. In addition, you can never place these hedges along the edge of the board. They must stay within the central spaces. And the last type of action that you'll see that is actually the same for all factions is called Distract. This action allows you to move the groundskeeper one space towards one of your mythics. This is a very strong action, and for that reason, a majority of these mythic factions don't actually start with any action points in their distract category. And so let's just say, for example, I'm playing as the fairies and we have a gnome mythic in this space right here. If I had a distract action available, I could spend it to move the groundskeeper one space towards this mythic. And when doing that, you always count the shortest route towards that mythic, which in this case would be this way, and they would move one space in that direction. Anytime the groundskeeper enters a space with a mythic in it, they capture that mythic, and if it is your opponent on your turn, then you score a point. However, if ever one of your own mythics are captured on your own turn, then you actually lose a point. Now, once the active player is done taking all of their actions, then their mythic phase ends and they move on to the groundkeeper's phase. Like I was mentioning earlier, during this phase, the groundskeeper just moves the number of spaces indicated towards their next destination. And so in this case, they would move 4 spaces, 1, 2, 3, towards the 1, and after arriving there, then they would start moving towards the next destination, which is the 2. During this phase, the groundskeeper must also spend 2 movement points when moving into a space that contains clutter. And so if they don't actually have enough points to spend, then they would stop in the space before it. And when moving the groundskeeper, again, you always have to move them along the shortest possible route towards the destination. And if there are multiple options, then the active player gets to decide. Once you're done moving the groundskeeper, as well as scoring or potentially losing any points for any captured mythics, then you move on to the cleanup phase of your turn, which is essentially where you reset all of your dice and you get to boost some of your actions. During this phase, any of your action dice that you even just partially spent must move all the way down to the left, and any dice that you didn't spend get to stay where they are. And so in this example, since I did not use my Antics ability, I get 1 action point for it in the next turn. Then, any tomes that you collected during your turn get added to your player board. And so these tomes are going to be added to the leftmost space of the action that you choose, permanently upgrading that action. So as an example, if I wanted to add this tome to the move ability, then this will permanently upgrade my action dice to the 2 and the 3 instead of the 1 and the 2, giving me a total of 5 movement points to spend instead of 3. And once that's done, then you get to boost 2 of your dice, which is going to be very important for unlocking some actions that you don't have access to. So because I don't have any base distract action points, I can use this as an opportunity to boost this die, which would gain me at least 1 going into my next turn. And then maybe I'll boost my wander action. And once you're done boosting both dice, then you reset all of your action dice to the number that's listed above. And that will tell you exactly how many action points you have for each action moving into your next turn. And that's essentially how a turn works. Now, as soon as the groundskeeper gets to their 3rd destination, they're going to use any additional movement points to get to the center square here. And then that is going to mark the beginning of the next phase, which is the After Dark phase. At that point, you're going to flip over an After Dark card, and it's going to give you 3 new destination locations, as well as new places to populate your tomes. And so at this point, any tomes that were left over from the first phase actually get removed from the board. During this phase, the game is played essentially the same way, with one major difference, and it is the fact that each player now has access to a very powerful After Dark special. And these abilities are going to be different depending on the mythic faction that you play as. And as soon as a player scores 10 points, then they immediately win the game. However, if the groundskeeper gets to their 3rd destination during the After Dark phase beforehand, then whoever has the most points at that point wins. And so let's go ahead and discuss the different asymmetries with the 4 new factions that come with Volume 2. The fairies are able to move hedges to basically anywhere on the board that's adjacent to an enemy piece, which means they can move a hedge all the way across the board if they needed to. Each Mythic faction also has a legendary ability that they can pretty much only use once until they refill the ability using a tome that they pick up from the board. The Fairies' ability is called Pixie Dust, and so their ability allows them to switch the spaces of the Tome Keeper and an enemy. And as their After Dark special, the fairies have a fairy ring that they can attach to an adjacent enemy. And then once per turn, they can move that specific enemy piece to diagonal space. And if ever that piece gets caught, that they can reattach the ring to another enemy once per turn. The gnomes have a split move ability, so they actually have two different types of move actions. They have a basic move action, and then they have the ability to burrow, which essentially allows them to move 2 spaces in an orthogonal direction, skipping everything in the first space, which means they can burrow past things like hedges as well as clutter spaces and basically move across the board. Their legendary ability is called Potion, and that allows them to reset any one of their action dice. And their After Dark special is called Uproot, and this basically allows them to move 1 destination token up to 1 space orthogonally once per turn, which could potentially either speed up the game or make the game longer depending on their strategy. Gargoyles, as you know, are made of stone, and so when moving around other mythics and hedges, they actually move in tandem with them. And their legendary ability is an actual stone. When taking their ability, they drop the stone under one of their gargoyles, and until their next turn, nothing can move or pass through that specific gargoyle. Similarly, their After Dark special is called Rubble, because as soon as it gets to that phase, it takes an additional move for an enemy to enter the space of a gargoyle, which means if the gargoyle is on a clutter space, it actually requires you to spend 3 movement points to enter that space. And finally, we have the werewolves, who are very physically strong. Their abilities allow them to fling mythics 2 spaces perpendicular to their own piece and heave hedges out of the way. As for their legendary ability, it's called Full Moon, of course, which is actually represented by the Full Moon ring. When taking the ability, they attach the full moon to a werewolf, and that werewolf can now fling over hedges. And their After Dark special is called Shredder, and so once it gets to that phase, then once per turn, they can just remove an adjacent hedge or clutter. And those are all 4 of the new factions that come with Volume 2. Now I just want to note that there are other modes of play, including a solo mode, a blitz mode, as well as a team game. And so for more information regarding those modes of play, as well as the Kickstarter details, we've included a link to the campaign in the description below. Thank you all so much for watching the video. I really hope it was helpful. But if you have any questions about anything that you saw here today, please feel free to leave me a comment down below, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. And if you enjoy content like this and would like to see more in the future, please consider subscribing. Thank you. Bye.